Welcome, everybody, to today's webinar, The Lawyer's Guide to a Comprehensive Open Source Compliance Program. My name is Bob Ambrogi. I am a blogger on legal tech at my blog, Law Sites, and also for Above the Law, which is producing today's webinar. And what we're going to be talking about today is this issue of open source compliance. Today, nearly every company that builds applications uses open source software, and the majority of organizations use significant amounts of it. Although the explosive growth of open source has yielded numerous benefits, not to mention including cost savings and faster time to market, it's also led to increased scrutiny of OSS license compliance. As a result, organizations without comprehensive compliance programs may face exposure to legal, reputational, and financial risks. So today we're going to hear from a leading expert in open source license compliance and learn the fundamentals of why it matters and how to build a compliance program. Specifically, we're going to talk about why OSS license compliance matters, the risks of non-compliance, compliance program sophistication levels, essentials of comprehensive license compliance programs, where to start if you're building a compliance program from scratch, and we will take your questions at the end. And on the issue of questions, let me just say that there is a Q&A box down in the lower left-hand side of your screen. You can submit questions or comments there. I will keep an eye on that throughout the program. As I say, we'll have a question period at the end, but if you have something during the course of the presentation, go ahead and drop it in there. And if it's relevant to what we're talking about at that moment, we may take it up at that point. Or if you just want to share a comment, there's no separate comment feature here, so we're happy to hear your comments as well as we go through this. Today's program is sponsored by FOSSA. FOSSA provides technology that helps a variety of organizations manage their use of open source software. Specifically, businesses use FOSSA to defend against vulnerabilities that can be found in open source software and to identify and comply with open source software licenses, which will obviously be the focus of today's presentation. And after this webinar, you're going to receive two different emails. You're going to receive an email from FOSSA, which they will be reaching out to everybody who's registered for today's webinar with more information and additional resources. In addition, you're going to be getting an email from the organizers of the webinar that will have a PDF of the slides that we're talking about today. You don't have to wait for the slides. There will be a resource center. You see a resource center on your screen, also down by the Q&A section, and there's a PDF available to be downloaded there. So again, you'll be getting that after the fact, but if you want the PDF, you can download that right away. So let me introduce today's speaker. She is Kate Downing of the Law Offices of Kate Downing. She's a technology-focused IP attorney and leading open source software licensing expert. Her extensive experience includes serving as co-chair of the Practicing Law Institute's annual Open Source Software Conference. She's authored multiple publications on open source software and counseled numerous leading enterprises on open source software related matters. Prior to starting her own San Francisco-based law practice, she held in-house roles at several companies, including at ServiceNow, the enterprise IT cloud company, and VMware, a provider of multi-cloud services for enterprise solutions. So I'm going to be turning it over to Kate. And as I say, if you have any questions as we're going through this, go ahead and drop them in there and I will bring them over to Kate's attention. But Kate, good to see you and take it away.
Thank you so much. Thank you everybody for joining. I'm going to jump right into it so we can really make the best use of all of our time here. I think this program is really for people trying to figure out what open source compliance means to them, what it may mean in the short term and the long term, and what a full compliance program looks like. So let's start from the very beginning about why we talk about open source compliance at all, why we talk about having a program. So almost all software out there uses open source to some extent, some more, some less. But I would say that at this point, even commercial software products, if you actually look at the code base, I would say upwards of 80% of the code base is open source, and only, the iceberg layer on top is actually written by the company that, is putting out the commercial code. So in terms of how much open source people are using, it's more than ever. And there's, like I said, there's basically no company I can think of that's not using open source, despite protestations to the contrary. They really are. So what does that mean for lawyers? What does that mean for compliance? So almost every open source license out there, as a very, the most basic requirement is that you provide attribution. So you usually have to provide copyright information for the open source package, as well as pass on the license of the package. So these kind of licenses, we call them permissive licenses because their requirements are very basic. There's also a set of licenses that we term copyleft licenses. In addition to the attribution requirements, these licenses require that you also pass on the source code to the underlying package. Depending on the kind of license that you have, we call them either weak copyleft or strong copyleft. You may also have to pass along modifications to that source code package if you make any. And you may potentially even have to pass on other code that package interacts with, right? A lot of times we talk about LGPL or GPL, right? And we talk about, whether or not the larger product that's using the package is a derivative work of that package. Because if it is, it could subject the larger package to that open source license as well. So those are the main concerns that we have when we're using open source. Have we done the attribution? Have we passed on the source code? Have we passed on modifications and or derivative works for the source code? And some of it gets a little bit even more specific than that. Some of it may also require build instructions, such that if I modify the source code, you have to be able to tell your users how to build again with that same piece of source code. So some of this can get pretty far in the weeds depending on the license that you're looking at and how you're using it. As part of the license compliance basics, I also like to add in a bullet point here about commercial licenses, because I think there's a reality that's happening, which is that, when you're doing open source compliance, you're also, any scanning tool that you use for this, any conversation you have with engineers about third-party code, you're going to touch on commercial stuff. Part of it is because the scanners find it. Part of it is because the engineers are using it. And a really big part of it is that these days, I think it's very hard to tell, is this actually a piece of commercial software, commercially licensed software, or is this open source? There's a lot of licenses out there that are called community licenses, share licenses, etc. And so a lot of times conversations with engineers and these policies will revolve around also making that distinction and figuring out how to treat that code as well, right? And where that fits into your policy. So we'll be mentioning commercial code again for that reason, because I think that in practice, when you're doing open source compliance, there's really no way to get away from the fact that you're really looking at all the third-party code that you're using as a company. So license compliance risks, right? No one would be doing license compliance if it weren't risky in some way, if they weren't trying to reduce a risk and, provide benefit to the company by reducing that risk. A lot of people ask me about that risk, and they start out, sort of talking like, oh, what are the chances we're going to be sued, regarding to open source, copyright infringement suits, patent infringement suits. Like, that's usually where people's minds go to when they're talking about open source. And that's fair, right? Because an open source license is an IP license, right? That is all, if you violate an IP license, there is always the risk of a suit regarding copyright or patent infringement. But I would say, in terms of risk, it's probably not your biggest risk. I would say that the biggest risk is really reputational. Right. I think a lot of companies these days, people are competing very heavily for good engineers. They're competing for talent. They are competing for mind share, right? They want to be in the news. They want to be talked about. They want to be on Hacker News. They want to be in Ars Technica, right? They want to be in all the places where people are talking about companies. And obviously you want that, you want that to be positive. And I think regardless of whether or not, legally you do or don't have, valid claims against you, even just that, nasty blogs, nasty news, right? It can be really negative for a company. It can be really negative in terms of being able to hire employees, being able to get investments, right? Being able to partner with the right people, right? Everybody in the tech space wants to be a good open source community player, and they will punish other companies who aren't. And I think that is really the number one risk that people face with open source these days, especially smaller companies, right? Because I think a lot of enforcement actions that are either done by, organizations that do enforcement for a living or other commercial entities, the reality is that that's aimed at larger companies. It's aimed at deeper pockets. And so a lot of small companies think to themselves, well, I probably won't be sued. I'm probably low down on anybody's, compliance enforcement list. But the reputational stuff, like there's no escaping that. Like that's a big deal for you, even if you are a small company. I will also say that, in terms of compliance risks outside of that sort of legal space, will there be claims? Will there be lawsuits? There's also, you're part of a compliance chain, right? If you sell to other customers, customers may want to know, hey, what's the open source and what I'm getting, right? Particularly if you allow your software to be resold, you work with resellers, you work with OEMs, or you put your software up on, let's say, various online marketplaces, right? All of those places will want to know about your open source. And so, if you want to participate in these sorts of, distribution mechanisms, if you want to, sell in that particular way, you have to be on top of your open source. But I would say like the number one thing that I see pushing clients towards open source compliance and towards, really taking these efforts seriously and formalizing their processes is investment rounds. Absolutely investment rounds, because there's no investment round that happens these days without investors asking you for a list of all the open source that you're using. And then, if you're looking at M&A, if that's like your potential exit, honestly, either whether you're doing IPO or you're looking to be bought, as part of the due diligence for those processes, you will be asked, about all the open source in your products. And further, you may be asked for proof that you have a policy, proof that, you're actually providing people attribution files, proof that you're actually making offers of source code and or, following through when you get requests, right? You're actually going to need to show that you're doing all the right things as part of that due diligence. And I've certainly seen investment rounds and M&As be conditioned on, people getting it right. So I've seen M&As, for example, where, a large chunk of the purchase price is actually put in escrow and won't be released to the acquired company until they actually follow through with all this open source compliance work. So that is a real risk. I have definitely seen that play out in real life. I will also say that I've seen this very interesting thing happen where, I work with clients on doing open source compliance and, they're very interested in the legal aspect of it. As we discussed, we're interested in, being ready for investment rounds, being ready for M&A. But as a side effect, I have seen that knowing what open source you're using, knowing where you're using it, knowing exact versions, right? Like really being on top of this stuff has actually helped people in security in ways that they didn't expect. Because some of these big bugs that have been found in very commonly used open source packages, people would not have known where to look for that in their platforms and their products if we hadn't been doing the open source compliance work, if we hadn't been keeping a record of exactly which versions we were using in which products. And I think that, we'll talk about this a little bit more, but like really big comprehensive open source, open source compliance processes, security heavily leverages these processes, even though they didn't necessarily expect to or didn't think they would, but they end up really benefiting from them. All right, so compliance risks. levels of compliance program sophistication. So, okay, I will start this way. I think that open source compliance is a lot like keeping a hospital clean. It's a lot like sterilizing, all medical spaces, right? And for anyone who has ever thought about this, right? Like there's no level of clean that's enough, right? Like you could mop the floors, you could wash, all the counter spaces, you could wipe the doorknobs, right? You could do it once a day, twice a day, every half an hour, every minute, right? There's no end to how clean something can be. There's no end to how much effort you put into this. And I think open source compliance for a lot of reasons is like that. But I don't say that to scare people. I say that hopefully to calm people down, because the reality is that like every other form of compliance at a company, you have to scale your compliance program to the resources that you actually have. Right? How much engineering effort do you have? Do you have, legal people who can handle this? How much budget do you have for tooling? How much budget do you have for, let's say, outside expertise, right? And given all the resources that you have and given the priorities that you're facing, you sort of have to figure out what are my top priorities? Where can I do, a portion of the work and really reduce most of my risk by doing that portion? That's what you have to figure out. And so, open source compliance is not going to be something that's going to be perfect out of the box, right? It's not like tomorrow you're going to wake up and you're going to institute this program and now you have 100% compliance. It's never going to be that way. It's always going to be sort of incremental steps towards getting more and more compliant. So what are those steps? Okay, so the first step, I call this the step of discovery. So, the first thing you really have to do is you have to figure out what's in the code. Right? What is in our products, right? And that usually involves doing some scanning, right? With some sort of tool to figure out, what is it that we're even using? What do we have on hand? And then looking through that and figuring out, like, is any of this commercial? Do we need to go get a license for it, or do we need to remove it? Is any of this under open source licenses that we just can't comply with because of the way that we license out our products, right? And then, you would potentially be looking at getting other licenses for those packages, or you would be looking at removing those packages or finding substitutes for them, whatever, right? So that's kind of the very first step, is just getting a whole handle on what is it that we have, how much, where. For a lot of SaaS companies, if you're doing purely SaaS, right, this is most of the process, right? Because you don't need to do attribution files. You don't need to provide source code for code that you don't redistribute. But that being said, there are still certain licenses that can apply to you, even if you run purely SaaS. And so you want to watch out for those. And like I said, the commercial stuff, that will likely still apply to you, even if you do purely SaaS. And so the scanning is still useful in that regard. So level 2, basic attribution reports. So I think a lot of smaller companies are at this level, right? They use either really basic, they use some sort of scanning, or they're keeping track manually of the open source that they're using, and they're publishing very basic attribution reports. Like, this is the name of the package, the version, it's under Apache, right? That's the totality of the information that they're providing. And this is a great place to be, right? I think if you're a really small company and you don't have a lot of resources, just being here is great. Right? This, being at level 2 compliance is usually what, investors are looking at. This is, that is basically the level that passes for an investment due diligence. So that's, that's a great thing to aim for when you're a small company. Level 3, I would call sort of more comprehensive compliance. So I think it's, it's knowing what's in your products, it's being able to do those attribution reports, but it's looking at your open source packages a little bit more closely, because in reality, most open source packages include, a main license, but they also include secondary licenses that aren't necessarily easy to find, but scanning tools can help you locate. So that, looking for those secondary licenses, I think, is a kind of a next level activity. I think the other thing is really getting your source code together for copyleft licenses and being able to provide that to people who request it, is also a fairly next level activity. And it's difficult to do. in practice. It's not easy because there's no tool that automates finding source code. Engineers really have to get into a good habit of pulling source code when they pull the binaries, because they're usually pulling binaries and that's what they're working with. They usually have no reason to pull the source, but they need to get good at pulling the source when they pull the binaries. And they need to do it in a timely manner, because a lot of times what happens is that, a week, a year, 2 years from now, that source code is nowhere to be found. And then you're really sort of up a creek because you needed to do compliance, but it's nowhere to be had. And so I think that's a fairly sophisticated level of compliance, but obviously one that everybody needs to reach at some point. And then level 4, so going beyond licensing. So, I talked in the earlier slide about, security really leveraging this process and, becoming intertwined with open source compliance so that they really understand the risk that's coming in, not just from their own code and their own engineers, but the external risk that they're accepting. And so I find that very sophisticated processes, will do that binding, right? And you really get, more specific things too, right? It's not just like, is it a license can we comply with? Do we need to get rid of it? I mean, they're going further, right? They're looking at, hey, we're using package A over here in order to do a particular thing. Why are we not using the same package over in this other space? Sorry, my video seems to have frozen.
Yeah, you're okay from our end. I think your voice froze for a second there too, but you sound good now.
Okay, yeah. So I think in level 4, you get a lot more people who are looking at open source usage from a bird's eye view, and they're saying, hey, why are we using package A over here and package B over here? Why don't we standardize on something, right? Or a lot of times you'll see, teams get very dependent on a particular package to the point where they're making contributions to that open source project. They may be making donations to that open source project. And again, like if one team over here is making a really big investment in this particular technology, why aren't the other teams of the company, leveraging that? And you will also see questions, for example, like why are we using, 10 different versions of something across, across the company, right? Because that also increases their overhead. And so, engineering and security are looking at this more closely and from an engineering, and security perspective, not just the legal perspective. So that I think is sort of the highest level of sophistication, is you really get everybody looking at this and not just legal, not compliance. Like it really becomes part of the fabric of the company and part of like the normal release process, that these are things that we're all looking at together. So how do we get there? What do we need to do to get to these levels? So I think, we talked about, that compliance needs to scale with your resources, right? And so, we're going to keep that in mind, right? There's going to be things here that, a small company can do, and then there's going to be things that they just can't do, right? And that's okay, but we're going to figure out what those are, right? And we're going to keep the target in our mind about where we're going, right? And sometimes that's like that's the most important thing, right? Is building the foundation to get to that next level of sophistication when you're ready for it. And so, let's see. Yeah, so I think that that's going to involve, really talking about people and process and tooling all together. So let's do that. So code scanning tools. You guys have heard me mention this already, even though way before we even got to this slide. I think in today's, coding environment, there's really no way to do open source compliance in a trustworthy manner without also using scanning tools. Any company that's using languages that take advantage of package managers just have a massive amount of open source that they're using, and a lot of times they're not even aware that they're using a massive amount of open source, because they'll say, we're pulling in, let's say, 3 packages directly, right? But they don't really pay attention to the fact that the package manager then goes and fetches all these other things that those packages rely on. And so suddenly, we're using 3 packages turns into, oh, actually we're using 150 packages, right? That is not a rare situation, but a lot of times engineers aren't aware of it because the package manager is doing all the work behind the scenes. And so to them, they're directly pulling in 3 things. They're not aware of all this other stuff coming in. And so I think, and it's also very difficult sometimes to figure out what all of that is. It is not obvious. So I think if you don't have scanning tools that you're using, I think you're at a really big disadvantage. Even engineers who are doing their very best to tell you, all the different things that they're using, and they're really doing a good faith effort of trying to write all of that stuff down. They're just not capturing everything. I just don't think it's possible in the current technical environment. There's a few languages, out there where they don't use package managers, and it is fairly easy to find out what you're using. But that's not what most people are doing these days. And particularly when you're talking about large pieces of code, entire platforms, right? We're not talking just SDKs. We're not just talking mobile apps. I just don't think that there's a way to do these lists manually anymore and really find them reliable. Yes, so I think the first step is getting some sort of tooling in place. There's a wide variety of things out there, and we should talk a little bit about the sorts of things that I think are useful. So I think one of the things that's useful is a tool that can run all the time. So it's something that you integrate into your company systems, and it just runs in the background. And maybe it does scanning, once an hour, or whenever there's a change to the code, or, once a day, whatever it is. But something that's a set it and forget it sort of system is really where you want to be, because you want to be on top of everything, especially when you're talking about SaaS development, right? People are putting in code and making code changes on the daily, right? They're not waiting for a release that's going to happen, in 5, 6, 7 weeks, right? They're doing it every single day. So really being on top of it is helpful. I would say the other thing that you really, we talked about this before about why you need scanning tools, to find those dependencies, right? I think if you have a scanning tool that's not doing that, that's worthless. You just can't. You have to have something that's able to do that for you. I also think it's very useful for something personally. I mean, this is a very legal perspective, but I think it's nice for scanning tools that have UIs that are not just for engineers, but UIs that are for lawyers and compliance people, where you can actually go in and you can see useful information about what's going on with the company at any given point in time. There are other scanning tools that don't have that, right? Like they'll do some sort of scanning and they'll provide an output, but there's kind of no UI to work with. And the only way to get that output is for a lawyer to call up an engineer and say, run this thing, right? And from my perspective, I don't think it's not really where lawyers and compliance people want to be. You really want to be able to just log in at any time and see what's up, see what's happening, right? And be on top of it, and not rely on, having to call somebody to ask for something. Obviously, you want to find a tool that works with all the different programming languages and frameworks that your own company is using. I think to that end, lawyers can have their wish list of what they want, in tooling about what they see as ideal. But the reality is that a tool isn't useful if the engineers don't want to use it, right? You could go through all the trouble of paying for a license and getting a tool, right? And going through, an entire RFP process and writing a contract, right? But once it lands, if the engineers aren't interested in using it, they're just not going to, right? And that's the end of the compliance program. So I think it's really important for that, decision to be engineering driven and for them to own it, because it's just not useful if they, at the end of the day, aren't excited about it and think it's problematic in various ways. There's something I want to talk about that's a little bit more technical about scanning tools. So scanning tools can work in one of 2 ways. So one thing that they can do is they can identify a particular package. They can say, okay, you're using Apache Tomcat. And they basically do that, via hash compares and that sort of thing, where they can sort of fingerprint a package and say, we recognize this is in our database, it looks like X. So that's sort of one form of scanning. But another form of scanning is more granular than that. It is looking at exactly what is in the package. It's looking at comments in the package. It's looking at license information in the package. Like, it's digging in the way a human would if they were to be looking through the source code. And I think you really need both of these capabilities for a tool to be good and to be effective, because a lot of the scanning tools that only identify a package but don't look inside of the package, they miss secondary licenses, and they miss information like this. So, like, for example, I've seen a package, in the past week where it's like, this package is mostly MIT, but there's a folder in here that, if you want to use this stuff in the folder, you need to go get a commercial license from us. So a package like that, I think if you're not looking at specifically the comments and documents that are in the package, I think it's very easy for a scanner to recognize that as MIT, and then you would totally miss this other part that's in there because no one's actually digging into the package with that kind of scanning tool. I think to some extent, that the other kind of scanning that also looks on a file by file level, like I said, I think that's really what you need in order to find secondary licenses. There are quite a few packages out there that, the one license is Apache or MIT, and you're like, great, that works for us. But then you find a piece of code that's, under license that doesn't work for you. And again, like, I think a lot of times you won't find that if you're not using a tool that can really dig in that way. So you really want both types of scanning. And I will issue a little bit of a warning, which is that I think when you're looking at tools, you should really look at, which of these tools is really for open source compliance? Like, who has that as like their mindset? And the reason I say that is because these days, I think there's a lot of security vendors out there that, primarily work on finding vulnerabilities, and, they sell to security teams, and they've sort of bolted on, various sorts of open source compliance modules, right? And then they say like, oh, well, this product is, dual use. But the reality is that the open source stuff is kind of an afterthought. It's not really what the product is designed to do. And so, like, what they offer is extremely limited. And a lot of times it is only the first kind of scanning, right? Where they can tell you this is Apache Tomcat, but then they can't tell you anything about what's in the package itself. It's really limiting. And the other part that I think is really limiting about those kind of tools is that a lot of them don't help you produce customer-facing attribution reports, right? Because at the end of the day, part of the output that you're doing as part of your open source compliance process, right, is you're putting together an attribution file. This is all the open source that we're using. This is how it's licensed, right? Here's all the copyright information, and you hand it over, right? Whether you're handing that over to a customer or a partner or an investor or whatever, right? But at the end of the day, you need to be able to hand something over. And a lot of these tools don't have that capability. They can show you in a UI like, oh, these are the different things we found, but they don't actually have a reporting feature, or the reporting feature is extremely limited, right? The report will say, for example, the report will be at that level of sophistication that we talked about, level 2, right? Where the report is just like, here's the name of the package, here's the version, it's under MIT. But they don't reproduce the copyright information, they don't reproduce the license, right? So either you're providing a report that doesn't really satisfy the license requirements, or you're doing that stuff by hand to supplement the report, right? And obviously, lawyers don't want to do that, right? We want to do as little by hand as humanly possible. That's why we pay these people money for licenses to their software so that they do it for us, right? So that's one big thing to look for. Okay, knowledge management and workflow. Okay, so when you're setting up these open source tools, you're generally going to be working with a specific person who's going to help set up the tool, right? This is the person who's going to install it internally. This is the person who's going to integrate it with, the company's various repos. This is the person who's going to show their teams how to get involved and how to use that tool. A lot of people really want to decentralize this function. I deal with a lot of clients who are like, great, every team will take care of their own, usage of the scanning tool, no problem. And it never works. It never, ever works. Because the reality is that this person who's responsible for setting up this tool and integrating it, it's it's a steep learning curve. Like, this is kind of a lot that you have to learn, right? Especially if you're an engineer and you've never dealt with compliance, you've never dealt with licensing, you've never dealt with lawyers. You try not to talk to lawyers as much as possible, right? Suddenly, you know, being part of this process and interfacing directly with lawyers is big and scary and confusing. And I find that usually what happens is that person who sets up the tool is also the person who, you know, let's say the tool finds something problematic. Usually a lawyer will call up the person who manages this tool and say, hey, I found this. Can you help me find the engineer and or the team who's responsible for this package, right? And then that person goes and finds the person. And then when they find the person, right, you have to explain to them why it is you have a problem, right? What's your problem, right? Is it that, you know, we don't have a license to this package, we get a license, or it's a license that doesn't work for us, or whatever it is, right? But a lot of times that person who helped you find the engineer responsible for that package is also the person who helps translate what you're trying to say to that engineer, right? Because that person talks to you all the time. That person has learned this process from beginning to end. And the engineer, the individual engineer that you're trying to have a conversation with, does not understand what you are saying, right? And you can't educate every single engineer on the very nuances of GPL, right? It's just not something you can really do. So I think it's very important to find the partner, right? The engineering partner who is going to help legal actually run the compliance process. And I will say that I find that that partner can come from any number of places. I have seen that partner coming in from DevOps. I've seen that person from release management, from the CTO's office, from security, right? Head of engineering, right? I mean, it can be a person coming in from any number of places, but whoever it is, you know, needs to be the sort of person who has a big bird's eye view on the company. And so it'll really depend on how your individual company is structured, like where it makes sense for this function and this person to sit. But this is a big responsibility. It is a big role. It's not something like one person can do in 10% of their time. And I think that the biggest obstacle that I see for companies in doing open source compliance and starting open source compliance programs is finding this one person. Because I think legal gets it. Legal's like, okay, we understand, we need a process, Kate said so, right? But then once you actually want to kick it off, you need that engineering partner. And I find that companies spend a lot of time trying to figure out who that's going to be. And I think that a lot of the times companies don't want to recognize that this is going to be a significant portion of somebody's job, but it really is, and they need to make peace with that before you can move forward and really build out the process the way you should. Okay, so that's sort of on people. In terms of actual like scans, right? Like, I think for things that are actually delivered to human beings, right, whether it's like mobile apps that you can get on the store, or it's, you know, SDKs that you can download, or whatever else, any other product that you have a regular release schedule for, I think the answer is easy, right? You need to be doing scans, you know, on a semi-regular basis, and then you need to be able to publish attribution reports and have source code ready for every release that you do, right? That timeline sort of writes itself. I think where it's a little bit more unclear is SaaS, in the SaaS space, right? Because like I said, people are usually doing development there on the daily, right? And so how do we manage that? How do we manage that risk? And I think, you know, it sort of depends on what your company does, how big your company is, right? How much process you guys are ready for, right? But I would say, you know, a lot of small companies start by doing, you know, scans of SaaS, you know, let's say once a month, right? Or once every 2 months, right? And then you sort of try to amp that up, right? So that you're as on top of it as you possibly can be. But certainly at the beginning, like you probably don't have a legal person who's going to be looking at scans on a daily basis, right? It's going to take a long time to get to that point. So you need to set up some sort of schedule for when you're going to look, but it'll really depend on your company what that schedule looks like. I will also say that, you know, these scanning tools, you know, they produce a wild amount of results, and they don't function as knowledge management. Like, they'll show you a snapshot of what's going on today, but it's not going to be a place where you go to look for something historical, right? Like, what was in this product 3 years ago, right? You need something else as your knowledge, your record of the knowledge of what you shipped in your product. It has to be something else that's outside of the scanning tool. Obviously, people use Jira tickets for this sort of thing, and various other ways that you can keep this information. I've seen, for example, like I've seen teams that have a scanning tool, they find problematic things, and they work it out via Jira tickets. Right? There's a ticket for every problematic item, and then we remember what we decided about it. I've seen people do Jira tickets for everything that an open source scanning tool finds, and the Jira is set to automatically approve if it meets certain requirements, right? So I've seen people take like that entire workflow out of the scanner, to the extent the scanner even has that workflow, right? And they put it into Jira tickets, and then sort of it's kind of up to them whether or not they keep a ticket for everything or they just keep a ticket for problematic things. Obviously, small companies are a lot of times doing this on spreadsheets, right? Keeping track of problematic items on spreadsheets and keeping track of how they're going to fix them via spreadsheets. It really just depends on, your company culture, what people are comfortable using, what people are willing to use, how people are willing to respond, all right? Okay, slide 12. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but I'd be remiss to say that to miss this licensing part of the open source compliance. Once you do have a scanner and you're running your scans, you need to know what is it that's okay, what is it that's not okay. That's really going to depend a lot on the individual product that you're looking at, on your business, right, and how you're selling it. This particular policy, I'm just showing very, very quickly, like this is a red, yellow, green light policy for a commercial product that is physically distributed. You're going to have something different for SaaS, right? You're going to have something different for mobile app. You're going to have something different for, let's say a permissively licensed, SDK or something like that. But you will set up a policy for the various products that you have. In fairly sophisticated scanning tools, you can actually encode this policy into the tool, and then the tool will only flag things that violate your particular policy. That's really ideal. Less sophisticated tools, scanning tools don't really have a place where you can put a policy. They just tell you what's in what they found, but there's sort of no flags. There's no ability to break a build, for example, if it breaks, certain policy rules. But it's really ideal if you have an open source scanning tool that can do that and is sophisticated enough for that. Okay, stakeholder review. I think we talked, we've been kind of talking about workflows and ideal processes. But I do want to talk a little bit more about what's involved. So, okay, let's say you have your scanning tool, you've set it up, it's doing continuous scanning. You as a lawyer or you as a compliance person or somebody who's serving a compliance role is looking at the results of the scan, and let's say the scan, it has a policy system and has flagged certain things for you. It has said, hey, we found, say, AGPL in your mobile app. We're going to deny this packet. We're going to break your build. Here you go. This is something you all need to take a look at. You need to examine, right? That's sort of the messaging that you get from your scanner. So when you get a message like that, then what happens, right? So scanning tools are not 100% accurate. Scanning tools have false positives. And that's true of every scanning tool I've ever seen. They are not 100% accurate. In fact, I would say that almost every scanning tool that I've seen has a very significant number of false positives. And part of it is because they're trying to be conservative, right? So for example, like we have scanning tools that, as soon as there's a mention of GNU, it assumes something is under GPL and it flags it to you as under GPL. Now, that's obviously not true. There's a lot of things that talk about GNU but are not GPL licensed, right? But the tool is trying to be conservative, right? It's trying to find everything that could possibly worry you, right? And so you're going to get false positives like that, where when you actually go and you're in the compliance role, you go pull the source code for that package, you look at what's in the package and you say, oh, there's no GPL here, right? This is a false positive, right? So that's one particular result. Another result could be you go pull the package, you find, well, the main package is under MIT. There's only one folder here on GPL. let's find out, like, are we even using this piece of code, right? Because a lot of times you'll see something that is permissibly licensed, but then maybe like certain test code, right? Test suites, sample code, et cetera, is under various licenses that can be problematic for you. But you talk to the engineer and they're like, look, like, you know, yes, this sits in the source code, it's in the source code repo, but when we go build the product, this part of the code, it doesn't end up in the product. Like, we don't actually ship this, right? So that's a kind of conversation that someone in the compliance role has to have with an engineer, right? And so, you know, you'd have to figure out who that engineer is, right? Like I said, like, I think there's usually one person, you know, who is legal's partner or compliance's partner who helps you find that one engineer for you to have that conversation with, right? A lot of people have that conversation via email or via Slack or via Jira tickets, right? Jira ticket is nice because you have a nice, good record of that conversation, right? And you know, we will remember, aha, this engineer looked into this and they said that this wasn't part of the package. Now we remember this forever. I don't have to ask them about it again when I see this again in the next release, right? Which you obviously will. But a lot of times when these problematic things come up, it may not just be a conversation between, you know, legal and the one engineer. It is in a lot of cases, but
I think you just froze again. Can't tell if it's
picking stakeholders. It's definitely figuring out.
All right. I think you froze for a second there, but I think you're back again.
Okay. Yeah. So an important part of the, you know, of creating a compliance program is figuring out the stakeholders, figuring out who wants to be involved, who wants to be part of the conversation. And certainly, you know, if something is problematic enough, the legal says, we just need you to remove it. Right. That's a conversation you're not just having with an individual engineer, right? That's the conversation you may be having with their boss, right? Or their boss's boss, right? Or even further up the chain, because at that point, you legal are sort of making a decision that drives the development timeline, right? That's really a product decision, and they have to partner with you on making that decision, making that call, right? And so a lot of it will be planning, right? It's not just, you know, I need you to remove this immediately, right? That's probably not going to happen, but I need you to remove this the next time you do a major release. Okay, that's probably something that they can agree to, but that's not something an individual engineer can agree to, right? That's something someone higher up in that organization needs to put on their product roadmap.
Good. Okay, just a reminder, we've got about 12 minutes left here, I think.
All right, sounds good. We talked about creating and packaging attribution files. You know, hopefully this is something that your scanning tool helps you to do. We've got a little example of what this looks like on the right, where you have the name of the package and the version and the license, right? And you reproduce the license and the copyright information. Ideally, you know, your scanning tool is helping you do this. But, you know, sometimes you may still need human review, right? I mean, you certainly need that when you're looking at problematic packages to figure out if they're really problematic and figure out what you can do about them. But you may also need to do this if, for example, you know, scanning tool says, oh, this package is on GPL, but it's not, then you need to go and you need to change this report, you know, to accurately reflect what's reality, right? Not just what the tool believes, but what you actually know is true. So some human review is necessary in this process, even with open source scanning tools that are awesome, right? Preparing source code, right? So this is in that, you know, remember we talked about sort of sophistication level. So that level 3, I think, is really where this fits in, is being able, you know, because a lot of copyleft licenses require you to make an offer to people who receive your code that you're going to provide them source code if they request it. You know, that level 1, level 2 compliance, you should always be making the offer. But, you know, level 3 is actually being ready to fulfill that offer, right? You know, that doesn't come up super often, but sometimes it does, and come up from a customer or a partner or an enforcement organization, right? And you really want to be ready to answer when people make that request. And we talked about, you know, the fact that this is like not super easy because it really requires engineering to get in the habit of saving source code as they develop. So it's a big change to how engineers work, right? And it's a change that it's going to take time to propagate, and that you're going to need, support from the upper levels of engineering in order for people to think that this is a worthwhile thing for them to do, that this is something that is part of their jobs. So that is that next level. I would say, once people do create, once you have open source attribution files, once you have source code ready to go, you also need to identify who's actually going to post this online or who's going to make this otherwise available with the product. Again, this goes back to stakeholders, right? And identifying responsibilities. A lot of times in practice, this will also be the person who's running the tool and who's legal's partner, but sometimes it can be a different team. Sometimes this could be like somebody on the web team even. But you have to figure out who that's actually going to be and make sure that they do that, in a timely manner. All right. I think we've talked about doing open source as a continuous process. I think one thing that's really important that we haven't talked about too much is this little thing that I think catches up a lot of people. So a lot of times people, they'll get the tool, they'll start scanning things, they'll set up the continuous scanning, but a product is always growing, right? Sophisticated, big platforms, for example, they can be made, depending on how you do things, right? It could be made up of many, many repos, right? Hundreds of repos, in fact, make up one single platform. And one of the things that you really need to make sure that you're doing is that anytime anyone in your company is creating a new repo, they have to go through the process of integrating it with your open source scanning tools. And this is where I feel like people really fall down, because they'll do the initial scans, they'll have information about what's in their product, but then they haven't created a process to make sure it's actually really continuous and that, what they're scanning is actually 100% of the product. They're not leaving things out. So that's one tidbit that I would add here, which is it's a bit of process, and it's, a process that needs to be documented and enforced, but it's not in legal's hands. It really is, that part of it really sits, with engineering or release management or whoever, right? But without that key piece, your process is just not complete, right? And your compliance isn't complete. Okay, so, I get questions from people, hey, where do we start? We're in, we want to do the compliance, but we have no idea how to begin. So I think obviously like getting a scanning tool, any scanning tool, that hopefully meets, the sort of the things that we've been talking about in this presentation, is definitely the first step. I think the second step is also inventorying what you have. I really can't understate how often I talk to clients that only have like a very, very general sense of everything that they develop, right? And the reason is because, most clients have like a flagship product, right? They, let's say they have a SaaS platform, right? And that's really all the lawyers think about a lot of the times, because that's like what their contracts are around. That's the commercial terms that they're working with. That's like most of the questions that they get. But a lot of times, even companies that have purely a SaaS platform will still have a whole bunch of other ancillary code that lawyers often don't know about. Like they'll have plugins, extensions, mobile apps, SDKs, sample code, right? They'll once they start actually digging in, they'll find out that there's all kinds of company code and all kinds of places and all kinds of distribution networks that they never thought about. But that's a really big part of starting, is figuring out what even is like the totality of everything we have. Right. And even something as simple as like, this is our main platform. Like I said, right, like that can be made up of hundreds of repos, and somewhere you need knowledge management to figure out what they are. What is that list? And that's actually not simple. Like I've actually seen clients spend months trying to figure out just this question of what is it that makes up our main platform. And a lot of times that information is really decentralized, right? Every little team knows the part that they're working on, but nobody has a list of everything. So that inventory, I know that sounds really basic and it doesn't even sound like legal work, but that is a really, really important part of the compliance process. And I think once you have that inventory, you can start talking about prioritization. What is most important here for us to scan and for us to understand? And I think a lot of companies are always kind of jumping in with, well, we must scan our SaaS platform because that's the moneymaker, right? That's like the important part, right? That's the most integral part to the business. But the reality is that, the things where open source liability is highest is the things that you actually distribute and the things that you distribute most frequently. And so, for example, if you're a company and you have a purely SaaS platform, you don't ever distribute it, but you do have a mobile app that you distribute, you should probably start by scanning the mobile app and not the platform. And I will also make a little bit of a legal note here, which is that I don't recommend doing scans of things that you're not looking at, right? Like there's no point in scanning a ginormous platform if nobody's going to look at the results, nobody's going to try to remediate anything, no one's going to try to fix anything. Like if you just have a scan sitting around, right? And that's because knowingly violating open source licenses and possibly copyrights and patents is not a good place to be. So don't run scans on things when you're not ready to actually deal with the results and you're not actually ready to start the compliance process on those products, right? Run scans, one product at a time. So that is the other thing I'd say. Well, I want to leave some room for questions. Bob, do we have some questions from the audience? You're still muted, Bob.
I'm sorry, I'm muted. I'm talking away here. I was going to say your presentation was so excellent that you anticipated a couple of the questions already in the course of what you've been talking about. For example, there was a question saying that in the questioner's experience in compliance, it's nearly impossible to fully remediate an issue so that everything you've done from the beginning of time is now in perfect compliance. So if you were looking at making sure things are clean from today forward, where would you focus first? I think you've pretty much just addressed that in your last slide, but is there anything else you would say about that?
Well, I would say that, if you find licenses that you can't comply with in your product, like you really need to make a roadmap for taking those things out of your product, right? Like the fact that like you have already had this in your product for a year or two, going forward, you still need to find a way to remove that stuff. And unfortunately, I don't think there's any escaping that.
Yeah, makes sense. Another question was, how concerned should a nonprofit organization be with the use of open source software?
Well, it depends on how you're using the open source, right? If you're using it only internally, your risk is quite low, right? Because most licenses don't have obligations that attach unless you do a distribution. And so I see that this question came from St. Jude's, right? So, to the extent that you're licensing, commercial software, right, to help you, let's say manage your documents, right, or help you with HR or your finance functions or something like that. I don't think you really should be worried about the open source you're getting from vendors as part of those services because you're not redistributing those services. But, if you're sitting from a different part of the hospital, let's say that actually writes software and you are actually redistributing software, to other hospitals or whatever, right, then you have you have kind of the same concerns everybody else has, because you can't avoid the open source license obligations, even though you're a nonprofit.
Yeah. Okay. And another question just came in here. There's a movement to create SBOMs as product is developed. What glaring omissions have you seen from companies that have adopted the SBOM paradigm?
Well, I think that from a license compliance perspective, the biggest thing is just that they're not detailed enough, right? I've seen these reports, right, where we talked about level 2 sophistication, right, where it's just like the name of the package, the version under MIT, right, but doesn't reproduce the copyright notice, doesn't reproduce the license, right? So those are really incomplete. Like those can be helpful in certain contexts, depending on who's asking and why they're asking, but it really doesn't fulfill your open source compliance obligations because you're really required to pass on that copyright notice and the license.
There was another question here that I think you did answer earlier in terms of the frequency of scan reports, and I believe your answer was it depends on the size of the company and other factors.
Yeah, I mean, like,
yeah.
in an ideal world, right, if you distribute a product, you're providing new open source information for every release, right? For, 3.2.1, right? Patch 2, right? You are doing open source compliance and you're providing attribution files. But, smaller companies in practice, like, just can't do it, right? And so you'll see that they're providing open source information only for like major versions of the product, for example, right? Or they'll do it for 3.2, but they won't do it for 3.2.1. Ideally, you should be doing it for everything, right? Because your open source obligation is that you provide all this information every time you distribute. But you have to weigh like the ideal versus what is actually possible.
Yeah. Real quick, I know we're out of time. It's just a question I had. You were talking earlier about the need to find somebody sort of on the engineering side to own this. What about on the legal side? Who's the right person to own this on the legal side, or is there a right person?
Usually this will sit with product counsel. I think that's kind of where it makes most sense because you're really talking about licensing, right? And in most companies, not every company, right, but a lot of tech companies, if so many people concerned with open source, product counsel would be the right place because they're probably most knowledgeable about licensing. I've occasionally, though, seen this sit with like a patent group because they happen to have the patent attorney who is also really quite open source savvy. But I will also say that, for smaller companies outsource this to outside counsel who's expert in this and helps them run this function. So it sort of depends on your size. I will say that open source compliance, I think it's kind of easy to get to the point where you can handle like 90% of things. I think a lot of in-house counsel can easily get to the point where they can handle 90% of open source questions. I think it's that last 10%, which is really hard, where you're really getting into like the nitty-gritty and it's unclear and confusing and you really have to be in the know and you really have to spend a lot of time on these problems to answer them well. And so it really helps, for that last 10% to have somebody that you can call, right, who is an expert and that you just have on speed dial, right? But I think, I think that expecting an in-house counsel who hasn't done this before to be able to reach that last 10%, I think is really, really hard. But I think getting to 90 and then having, somebody you call on the outside, I think is a good goal.
All right. Well, we are out of time. Kate, thank you. That was a really, really fascinating and well-presented presentation. So thank you. And thanks again to FOSSA for sponsoring today's webinar. Thanks to everybody at Above the Law for producing it and making it happen. And most importantly, thanks to everybody in the audience for attending today and for the thoughtful questions you submitted. A reminder, you're going to get an email with the slides, information on accessing the slides from today, and also a follow-up email from FOSSA with more information and additional resources there. So on that, that concludes today's webinar. Thanks for watching.
Thank you.